5 years after my wife slapped me across the face at her own birthday dinner in front of every single person we knew, I stepped off a private jet in my hometown to attend an exclusive meeting of self-made millionaires, and within an hour of landing, I received a piece of news about her that stopped me cold in the middle of a crowded room. My name is Thomas Reyes, and I need to tell you how I went from being humiliated at a dinner table to standing in a room full of the kind of people I used to only read about, and what I learned that day about the woman I once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before that dinner, to understand why what happened hit me as hard as it did. I was 34 years old, married for 6 years to a woman named Vanessa, and honestly, for most of those 6 years, I thought we were building something real together. I worked as a mid-level project manager at a construction firm, decent pay, nothing glamorous. Vanessa came from a family with a bit more money than mine. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties, and I think some part of her never fully let go of the idea that she had married beneath what she deserved. I don't say that to make myself sound like a victim from the very start, because honestly, I loved her, and for a long time, I believed she loved me too. We had our struggles, like every couple does, arguments about money, about how much time I spent at work, about whether we'd ever be ready to have kids. But nothing prepared me for what happened on the night of her 32nd birthday. Her mother had organized the whole thing, a private room at an upscale restaurant downtown, maybe 30 guests, Vanessa's friends, her extended family, a few of my coworkers who'd been invited out of politeness more than anything else. I remember feeling out of place most of the night, the way I sometimes did at events with her side of the family, like I was a guest in someone else's life rather than an equal partner in my own marriage. But I pushed through it, because it was her night, and I wanted her to be happy. About halfway through dinner, Vanessa stood up to make a toast, thanking everyone for coming, and then, almost as an afterthought, she turned to me and said, in front of the entire room, that she wished I had, at least tried to dress like I actually belonged here. I laughed it off at first, thought maybe it was a joke, a little too sharp but still a joke. But then her cousin, sitting near the head of the table, laughed loudly and added something about how I probably couldn't afford anything better anyway, and Vanessa didn't correct her. She just smiled. I felt my face get hot, that particular kind of humiliation that settles into your chest before you even fully understand why. I quietly asked her, once she sat back down, if we could talk outside for a minute, just the two of us. She rolled her eyes, loud enough for the table to hear, and said, "Can you please not make everything about your feelings tonight, Thomas? It's my birthday." And when I gently took her arm, just to guide her toward a quieter corner of the room to talk privately, not aggressively, not forcefully, just a hand on her arm, she pulled away sharply and slapped me across the face, hard, right there at the table, in front of her friends, her family, my co-workers, everyone. The room went completely silent. I stood there for a second, my cheek burning, 30 faces staring at me, some in shock, a few, I swear, almost amused, like this was entertainment. Vanessa didn't apologize. She didn't even look embarrassed. She looked at me like I had done something to deserve it, straightened her dress, and sat back down like nothing had happened. I want you to imagine that feeling, standing in a room full of people who are supposed to be your family, your friends, and realizing in that exact moment that not a single one of them is going to say a word in your defense. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I simply picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, said, "Happy birthday, Vanessa," in the calmest voice I could manage, and walked out of that restaurant. I went home that night, and instead of waiting for her to come back so we could talk about it, which is what the old version of me probably would have done, I did something I had honestly never imagined myself capable of. I packed 2 suitcases with what mattered most to me, checked into a motel on the edge of town, and the next morning, before Vanessa had even woken up from wherever she'd ended up after the party, I was already gone. Not just from the house. From the city entirely. If you've ever had a moment where something inside you just quietly decided enough was enough, no dramatic speech, no big explosion, just a calm, final decision, I think you'll understand exactly what that morning felt like for me. And if this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because what happened over the next 5 years is honestly the part of my life I'm proudest of, and I promise you, the ending is worth staying for. I want to be clear, I didn't vanish out of spite or to punish her, even though I know it probably felt that way to her and to everyone else. I left because I finally understood, sitting in that motel room with my cheeks still slightly sore, that I had spent 6 years slowly shrinking myself to fit into a life where I was tolerated more than valued. I moved 3 states away, to a city where I didn't know a single person, which honestly terrified me and freed me in equal measure. I threw myself into work in a way I never had before, not out of anger, but because for the first time in years, I had nothing pulling my attention away from building something for myself. I picked up freelance project management contracts in construction and renewable energy development, work that eventually led me into small-scale investment opportunities in solar infrastructure projects, an industry I'd honestly stumbled into almost by accident, through a contact I made on one of my very first contracts in that new city. I won't pretend the next 5 years were some smooth, easy success story, because they weren't. There were entire stretches where I barely made rent, nights I questioned whether leaving everything behind had been the right call at all. But slowly, contract by contract, relationship by relationship, I built something real. By year 3, I had my own small consulting firm advising mid-sized energy companies on project logistics. By year 4, I'd taken an equity stake in 2 solar development projects that, almost overnight it felt like, became extremely valuable once federal energy incentives shifted the entire market in our favor. By year 5, a firm I'd been quietly consulting for reached out to invite me to something called the Meridian Circle, an invite-only annual gathering of self-made entrepreneurs and investors, people who'd built real wealth from nothing, hosted that particular year, coincidentally, in the very city I'd once fled from in the middle of the night. I remember laughing out loud when I saw the location on the invitation, because 5 years earlier I'd left that city with 2 suitcases and a burning cheek, and now I was flying back into it on a private jet chartered by the event organizers, set to sit in a room full of millionaires as one of them. I landed on a Friday afternoon, and honestly, the whole experience felt surreal, stepping off that jet onto the same tarmac I remembered from years of ordinary commercial flights, now walking through a private terminal instead. I had about 2 hours before the opening reception, so I checked into my hotel, and it was there, scrolling through messages while getting ready, that I saw a text from an old mutual friend, someone who'd stayed loosely in touch with both me and Vanessa's family over the years, someone I hadn't heard from in at least 2 years. The message simply said, "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but I thought you should know before you run into anyone tonight. Vanessa's going through a really rough time. Her dad's dealership business collapsed under some fraud investigation last year, and from what I heard, she lost pretty much everything in the fallout, the house, most of her savings. She's actually working retail now, over near downtown." I sat on the edge of that hotel bed for a long moment, phone in my hand, trying to process it. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not really, even though a small, petty part of me, the part still holding on to the memory of that slap and that laughing cousin, might have expected to feel something like satisfaction. Mostly, I just felt this strange, hollow sadness, remembering the version of Vanessa I fell in love with before all the family pressure and status anxiety turned her into someone who thought humiliating me in public was acceptable. I went to the opening reception that evening anyway, met people whose stories mirrored mine in strange ways, people who'd been underestimated, dismissed, sometimes humiliated by the very people who were supposed to support them, before building something entirely their own. Somewhere in the middle of that reception, an older man named Gerald, who'd built and sold 2 manufacturing companies over his career, asked me what my story was, how I'd ended up here. I told him, briefly, about the birthday dinner, the slap, the 2 suitcases, and he laughed, not unkindly, and said something I've thought about often since. He said, "Some people only build real wealth once they finally stop trying to prove something to people who never really saw them in the first place." I ran into Vanessa 2 days later, actually, completely by accident, at a coffee shop near my old neighborhood, a part of the trip I'd carved out on my own, separate from the Meridian Circle events, just to quietly walk through the streets I used to know. She looked different, tired in a way I hadn't seen before, and when she recognized me, her whole expression shifted through about 4 emotions in the span of 2 seconds: shock, embarrassment, something that might have been hope, and finally, something that looked a lot like shame. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, sitting at a small table by the window. She apologized, actually apologized, for the first time in the entire history of our relationship, for that night, for years of small cruelties before it that I don't think I even fully processed until I had enough distance to see them clearly. She asked, carefully, almost afraid of the answer, what I'd been doing all these years, and when I gave her the short version, the consulting firm, the solar projects, the invitation to the very city we were sitting in, I watched something complicated pass behind her eyes, this mixture of genuine happiness for me and a very real grief over what her own life had become since her family's business collapsed. I didn't offer her money. I want to be honest about that, because I know some people watching this might expect some big dramatic gesture where I swoop in and rescue her out of guilt or lingering love, and that's not what happened, because that's not who I am anymore, and honestly, it wouldn't have been healthy for either of us. What I did offer her was something smaller but, I think, more meaningful. I told her that despite everything, I hoped she found her own version of what I'd found, work that made her feel valued for who she actually was, not for the image she could project at a dinner table. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you, and if you haven't yet hit subscribe, this is exactly the moment to do it, because there's a whole channel full of stories just like this one, real people rebuilding real lives after moments that felt like the end of the world at the time. I flew back home 2 days later, back to the city and the life I'd actually built for myself, the one that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone from that old dinner table. I think about that slap sometimes, still, not with anger anymore, mostly with a strange kind of gratitude, because as painful as that moment was, it was also the exact moment I finally stopped shrinking myself to fit into a life that was never really built for me in the first place. These days, my consulting firm has grown well beyond what I ever expected back in that motel room 5 years ago, and I've learned to measure success a lot differently than I used to. Not by whether I fit in at someone else's dinner table, but by whether I can look at my own life and recognize it as something I actually built, on my own terms, out of a moment that once felt like complete and total humiliation. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: sometimes the worst moment of your life isn't actually the end of anything, it's just the exact push you needed to finally walk toward the life that was always waiting for you, if you were only brave enough to leave the table. Thank you for listening to mine, and I'll see you in the next one.